Hi, this is your Sapna Bharti and we are here at KubeCon+CloudNativeCon in Salt Lake City, Utah. And today we have with us Julian Fischer, CEO and founder of anynines. Julian, it's good to have you back on the show in person again.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And of course, we saw your booth here. You folks are announcing Klutch here at the busy. So Klutch is of course going to be at the center. But I will start with you have been attending a couple of KubeCons. So I just want to hear from you. You have a booth this year. What kind of audience? What kind of discussions? What kind of questions? Especially when people see Klutch, you're seeing here.
Well, first of all, the conferences are getting bigger. Depending on where your booth are, you're getting more or less attention. Well, this time we actually got a lot of interesting questions from folks who start to recognize the problem that occurs if you run a lot of Kubernetes clusters. So if you remember our earlier conversations, there was more like an educational thing, right? That we predicted that this is going to happen, and now it's actually happening. So a lot of questions evolve around how does Klutch solve these things, but you don't have to explain the problem the same way you had to like 1 or 2 years ago. People now are starting to get it.
And can you just hint at what are the problems people are, talking about?
In Kubernetes, you see, in the past years, there was a strong focus on more ops-related Kubernetes usage. And now Kubernetes gets more and more into application developer experiences, which means that if you're looking at application developers at your primary audience and less lift and shift from moving away from VMs, then you need to provide them the appropriate tools to, for example, have the on-demand developer self-service application developers want. So in this regard, one of the challenges, how do you get a database up and running from a Kubernetes cluster? And especially if you have a lot of them, you may not want them to operate alongside your application in the same cluster. So and then the question is, how do you actually remote control a cloud service from a Kubernetes cluster in a way that it scales to hundreds of Kubernetes clusters? And that's exactly the challenge we accept with Klutch and solved it.
And since your anynines, roots are also in the Cloud Foundry, and Cloud Foundry is all about developer experience, CF push and all those things. Can you talk about the origin of Klutch? Where did the kind of the foundational blocks come from, and where you're looking at the problem? Because as I said, the Cloud Foundry experience helps a lot.
Yeah, I mean, Cloud Foundry, when it comes to building large-scale developer platforms, is still a very unique technology in the sense that we run environments where there are thousands, if not 10,000s of apps running in a single environment. And the developer experience was always the strong side of Cloud Foundry and still is. So if you ask the question, what does it actually mean? Then it's one side of the equation is about deploying applications and running it in containers. But the other side of the equation is, if you have 1,000 apps, they are likely to require something between 1,000 or 2,000 data services. And where do they come from? And Cloud Foundry answers that question by providing a standard on how to create cloud services, the Open Service Broker API standard, and that introduces abstractions. So for example, a service instance and a service binding, answering the questions how to provision a database by creating a service instance, and how to grant a particular application access to a data service instance by creating a service binding. We extend that with backup and restore, but if you think about what is the goal when building an application developer platform, the goal is to provide application developers with the means of on-demand self-service so that they can deploy and run their apps on their own without the involvement of other humans, and at the same time to give them the operational responsibility of their entire application system, both for the app and the cloud services they bind to. And that in Cloud Foundry was somewhat addressed, and in Kubernetes it is not. Coming back to your actual question, Klutch evolved from the idea, we've built the anynines data services, the automation, declarative automation, for up to 10 data services different data services that you can, on demand provision from a Cloud Foundry. So we just ask ourselves, all right, why do we limit that offering, to Cloud Foundry, where the problem exists in the Kubernetes ecosystem as well, and especially in large environments, having a homogeneous database automation layer that works across infrastructures and on-premise infrastructures as well is something we thought can be positioned as well. So we thought, how would you expose the anynines data services in Kubernetes? And then we discovered the actual data service challenge is also existing in Kubernetes, but it is slightly more complex because you can't map a single Cloud Foundry environment to a single Kubernetes cluster. Means that you have multiple, if not many, Kubernetes clusters. And then you have that additional layer of complexity where you have to solve, in the absence of a central cloud controller and the absence of an open service broker API, how to do that systematically, how to expose data service to Kubernetes clusters. And then we took what we've learned in Cloud Foundry was so valuable, and that's basically the entire idea of Klutch, is you take the abstractions from the Cloud Foundry ecosystem that work, but translate them into a Kubernetes native technology. So in other words, Klutch emerged from the idea of expanding anynines data services to Kubernetes, but then we figured, well, actually the problem must occur at any place for any organization that uses a lot of Kubernetes clusters and somehow needs to deal with data service management in a systematic way, for example, to comply to security regulations. And then we also understood that Klutch is more than just an adapter for the anynines data service, and that it is addressing a much wider audience, and that we should provide it to the public to give back. After we've leveraged open source so much, we wanted to contribute back something to the community that's valuable and solves a contemporary problem.
Now, can you also talk about, you and I have talked a lot about open source aspect, of anynines and now it's also seeing that you folks are, getting into that, releasing the Klutch and getting into the open source space as well. Why did you choose KubeCon+CloudNativeCon to kind of debut, expose Klutch to the rest of the world?
Well, frankly, we chose Container Days as the debut. That was in September. But KubeCon is also, a conference that's spot on addressing the Kubernetes community. And, it's the main target audience. It's like everybody with a lot of Kubernetes clusters will come to the problem that Klutch solves. And we're here to advertise both the awareness of the problem, but as I said, there is already more awareness than in the years before, but then also advertise a potential solution and share what we've got with people who want to adapt to it.
What are some of the challenges that organizations face with multiple Kubernetes clusters, and how Klutch solves some of those challenges?
Application developers should be able to describe their entire application system without leaving Kubernetes. So even if you're, let's say, on a hyperscaler like Amazon, and you create an EKS cluster and you want to get to an RDS database, you have to step outside of Kubernetes in order to get to RDS. Then you have to create an IAM user, you need to create a policy. It's a non-trivial thing to do. And well, you could argue, why not create an operator, put it in the application cluster that then talks to the AWS API? But think, what if you create 100 clusters and you want to consume not only RDS, but many other services? And there should be in the future maybe also a deployment on Azure and maybe on Google Cloud. So having a unified way of managing data service across clouds is very interesting. And one of the operational challenges platform teams will have to solve is, for example, let's say you have 4,000 or 5,000 databases running. And now there's a CVE, and you want to, ask the question, hey, how many service instances do we have that are affected by that particular CVE? So you want to be able to ask, where are the service instances? Where are they being used? So you want that central control. And that's what Klutch enables. So every application cluster, where the application developer locally asks for a database, well, it stores that information, replicates it to the Klutch server, and the Klutch server then stores that state and can be asked, hey, where are those service instances? And it's the Klutch server that then delegates the actual provisioning to the automation backend.
As earlier we were talking about the whole developer experience, how does Klutch kind of maintains, enhances, bring back the developers into the Kubernetes ecosystem?
It is very important, especially if you're talking about application developers. Most of the application developers, they aren't DevOps experts, right? If you look at large organizations that are, on a path of a digital transformation, application developers don't have the time to focus on, hey, how do you run a database within Kubernetes? Or stepping outside and learning how AWS works is also complicated for them. You want to provide them with an interface that's easy to learn and easy to handle, but is mighty enough to give them the operational, responsibility for a database. And that's the abstractions that are introduced by Klutch, like the service instance, like the service binding, a backup plan, a restore and a backup. So that covers the lifecycle of the data service to the extent necessary. So for example, if an application developer, does a mistake and wants to revert back to a backup, that's self-service capable. You just execute a restore operation and you go back. And Klutch takes care of this by delegating it to the automation backend. And now one major question is like, what are the kind of data services that Klutch can actually mitigate and integrate? And we've been thinking about that quite a lot, and how to do that in particular, because there were already technologies in the CNCF, such as Crossplane, for example, where Crossplane seems to be the technology of choice when trying to reconcile from Kubernetes the creation or management of resources that are potentially outside of a Kubernetes cluster. And with data service backends, this might be the case. However, Klutch is more domain specific, more specific to cloud service management than Crossplane is, in a sense that it provides those abstractions that are the foundation for the developer experience. So Klutch introduces those abstractions, but in the end leverages the mighty and the vastness of cross-plane integrations that there are. So you can use anything that has a cross-plane integration and write a Klutch integration from it with relatively easy means, and thus leveraging the growing cross-plane ecosystem as well when integrating services using Klutch.
Is Klutch ready for production, or are you running some betas? What is the state right now?
So Klutch is fully implemented in the sense that you can expose services through Klutch. We are using Klutch internally and it works. We have integrated both open service broker API services like the anynines data services. We also integrated Kubernetes operator, in this case our Postgres. So yeah, Klutch can be used and is working. We are now looking for startup clients who are willing to do POCs where we install Klutch with them. We are open to write more automation backends. We are currently, for example, integrating some AWS services like S3 and RDS, and are open to integrate services from other cloud providers as well. And that will enable the productive use of Klutch.
And how people can get started with Klutch?
You can go to Klutch.io. There's a dedicated website, and have a self demo. We prepared the ability to use 2 Minikube or kind clusters on your local computer to get the Klutch experience and a hands-on experience with Klutch. This will use the AWS Postgres as a potential data service backend.
And is there any open source aspect of Klutch and commercial aspect of Klutch?
Well, Klutch is entirely open source under the Apache 2 license. We are planning to apply for CNCF sandbox status at some point, but we just want to collect a few real-world adopters that are outside of our organization before we do that. The commercial add-ons that build on top of Klutch are part of our data service management suite called Anynines Hub. That includes the Anynines data services, the VM-based data service, so to say, the AWS data services, which are pod-based, as well as add-ons commercial add-ons for Klutch.
Can you also talk about what value will CNCF ecosystem get by moving Klutch into the sandbox?
So, in our belief, anybody who uses a lot of Kubernetes clusters will have the challenge on how to offer, any cloud service to application developers when coming to that, aim to build developer platforms using Kubernetes, which is a trend. The Kubernetes ecosystem has been building up to this application developer platform story for the past years. So I predict it will become more popular, and then you will stumble across this challenge. This could be the challenge of how to expose internally provided cloud services. Let's say one team creates an app, a service that is to be consumed by other teams. How would you do that? Why not using Klutch? Because writing integrations is relatively easy. But also if you're a data service provider or an infrastructure provider, you think about that AWS use case for a second again. Let's say once we integrated the 5 or 10 most popular data services, people can create EKS clusters with ease and consume cloud services with their most frequently asked usage patterns from within a Kubernetes cluster without stepping out of the Kubernetes cluster. And that brings the DevOps experience, like a GitOps approach, to the next level. So we believe that Klutch will be applicable to any situation where you have multiple Kubernetes clusters in an organization.
And let's hypothetically assume that Klutch does get accepted into CNCF sandbox. And now when we look at graduation, they have a lot of criteria. So what kind of people you want to get involved with the Klutch, because you have to build a community around Klutch. So talk about why people should look at Klutch and get involved with it, what value they will get out of it.
So as I said, if you're a provider of cloud services or an infrastructure provider with cloud services, or you want to expose your own cloud services that you created internally, anybody will benefit from having Klutch, because otherwise you have to go through that tedious process of writing that integration framework, which is a non-trivial thing to do. So we've building for the past 1 to 2 years, Klutch. And if you think you can just use crossplane for the same matter, you'll be running into underestimating that challenge like we did in the beginning. And at the end, you'll have to, build something similar. So I would say anybody who wants to cut that corner and get to, the result much faster will be happy to contribute or be part of the Klutch ecosystem.
What kind of iteration or evolution of Klutch you have in mind going forward? Of course, once it becomes the CNCF sandbox, then the whole community will be involved. But what vision you have for Klutch?
I think Klutch is the foundation for building many more services and add-ons on top. So for example, depending on where and how your automation backend, what that actually is, you also have to ensure that service instances can be reached from within a Kubernetes cluster. So that requires a network path to be present. So whenever you, as an application developer, utter the intent that you want to have a database instance, for example, both the local Klutch extension in the application cluster, but also the Klutch server knows about it. So that basically creates the event that you need. All right, now you need to establish a network connection. So you could also see that Klutch becomes the foundation, building an eventing network or an eventing framework that allows for triggering certain behavior and adding add-ons to actually fulfill that behavior, desired behavior, make it much simpler to integrate and make Kubernetes-based landscape possible. And so a lot of the ecosystem was evolving around individual Kubernetes clusters, but Klutch is one step where you're looking into landscapes of Kubernetes clusters that form relationships with another and with the underlying infrastructure, as well as with services that are put on top of it. So if you think, for example, about billing and internal cost allocation, the Klutch server will always know when services have existed and when they cease to exist. That's also what you need to know in order to, let's say, for example, create an invoice or assign charges internally in internal cost allocation. Or for that matter, once you've created the service instance and the user expressed the intent to bind a particular Kubernetes application to a service instance. There's also a security question. How do you do dynamic firewalling so that only this cluster or this application can talk to that service instance? So we have solved a similar problem with the anynines data service in the Kubernetes world, where we have a component called the anynines service guard that monitors both dynamic sides. So, for example, in on-demand provisioning VMs, IP addresses of service instance will change constantly, for example, doing an upgrade or a scale out. And so do applications in containers change a lot. And, Klutch builds the foundation to create security events and do implement monitoring tools that will take care of dynamic security in this regard, as an example.
Julian, thank you so much for joining me here at KubeCon, and thanks for talking about Klutch. And once again, it's great to see open sourcing your technology, and good luck with sandboxing and sooner or later the graduation of Klutch. Thanks for your time today, and as usual, I look forward to having you on the show again. Thank you.
Always great talking to you. Hopefully you enjoy the conference as much as we do.